culture reconciliation, peace building, what is the indigenous knowledge and the wisdom that we have in Africa? And I will look at experiences from East Africa, Uganda, and from Southern Africa as well. And I will conclude with some insights and some suggestions for Mozambique. So since the beginning of time, human societies have always had customary rules, social sanctions, and indeed ethical wisdom to regulate their societies, to regulate the relationships between members of the society. And so we can look at the common themes that emerge from across societies on the need and the responsibility to maintain social harmony and peace by utilizing ethical wisdom. And I would say that African societies have a very rich tradition, rich cultural tradition of ethical wisdom, which can also be utilized to promote peace. And I think in our day and age, this is crucially important if we are going to be able to counter the forces of, that are seeking selfish advantage, to counter the forces that are seeking to accumulate wealth at the expense of others. And I mentioned already the corruption, which, if left unchecked, could lead to violent conflict. The crisis of governance in Africa, the crisis of government in Africa, I think we have discussed extensively. The desire for political domination of a country, private accumulation of wealth, corruption we've mentioned already. And I would say that this is part of the driving factor, one of the drivers of conflict. And I know that ASA might be starting this project on drivers of conflict. I think it's very important to look at this issue. Misrule of law, corruption, oppression of the opposition politician, prosecution of the media. It's necessary for us to interrogate whether, in fact, these nation states we have in Africa, have they really transcended? Have they really let go of that colonial logic of domination, of aggression, of exploitation and subjugation? I would argue that this logic of a small group controlling and dominating still persists and is a reality in many of our African countries. So the crisis of governance, I would say, can be linked to the problem of the malformation of our nation states. We talk of these states as though they really exist. Look at the case of Somalia. There has been no functioning government for almost 20 years. And I would say that the forces of colonization that entrenched and left these nation-state imprints across our continent created some of these dynamics which we are now dealing with. African nation-states, I would argue, remain programmed with this colonial logic of control, dominion, dehumanization, subjugation, oppression, exploitation, and manipulation. So if we are going to heal the Pan-African body politic, I think we need to continue with the incomplete project of decolonization. Decolonization did not end when the countries became quote-unquote independent, because we can see now that there is economic control by powerful actors behind the scenes working in collusion with some of our so-called leaders to continue to extract our resources, ship them offshore to Panama. We know about the Panama Papers, private bank accounts elsewhere, right? So I say there is a fundamental problem in how we have constituted our countries, We can even interrogate whether these are appropriate constitutions, and we can draw on culture and African ethical wisdom to try to rethink, to build a new society, to have a new economic model that distributes the resources, that affirms solidarity within the society, and a politics that accommodates difference of opinion. I think this is fundamentally one of our challenges when we talk about economic governance. Unless we can deal with those issues, the challenge of economic governance will remain, and the challenge of the equitable distribution of resources in Africa will remain. And the symptoms of these deeper fundamental challenges are the violent conflicts that we see, illicit trade in weapons, drugs, human trafficking, and these now increasingly have interstate dimensions. Our borders are so porous, you can trade, you can move anything across the border if you're determined enough. So this illusion of sovereignty we must also dispense with. We can see this manifesting now in South Sudan, where 3 or 4 countries, Uganda, Sudan, are involved and have interests in that crisis in South Sudan. Same thing in North Africa, places like Mali. I mentioned extremism already. Unless we understand some of these fundamental challenges, we will continue to see the fragmentation of the state, gender-based violence persisting, and these resource-based conflicts are going to increase in Africa unless we actually stop and interrogate what is the fundamental problem. Natural resource extraction to serve selfish interess, Machiavellian maneuvering amongst the political elites are not going to help the citizens of Africa. And so we need to urgently address that issue. In terms of peace building, just to contextualize a little bit, this is not a new term. I think many of you will be familiar with this term. 1992, Boutros Ghali of Egypt issued the Agenda for Peace following a review of the high-level panel on threats. And they issued an outcome document in the 2005 United Nations General Assembly. One of the recommendations was to establish a UN Peacebuilding Commission, but even that institution has now suffered through the usual bureaucratic maneuverings and has failed to deliver peace to many countries, some of which are Africa, Burundi, Sierra Leone. And 2 years ago, the Secretary General of the UN convened an expert advisory panel on peace building, which has now issued a report. And then to add to that, there was a review of what was called the Millennium Development Goals, because we did not deliver on the Millennium Development Goals in 2015. There was the establishment of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a little bit of rebranding. And goal number 16 speaks very specifically to the issue of peace, socioeconomic justice as the foundations for a more stable society. But we should not become too beholden to the institutional agendas that operate from external assumptions. We need to engage with African societies, African people, to understand what are the key issues that are affecting them and their communities. We need to be aware of this logic of UN building, UN interventions for the sake of the UN, for its institutional self-preservation, and we can discuss that in the discussion. I think there is a strong case, given this multiple external interventions with limited success, to look inward into Africa's ethical wisdom. And there is a lot of wisdom within the African continent, a lot of cultural insights that we can draw upon. And I think we need to take some time, the research organizations need to take some time to invest in projects that will interrogate what do we have in Mozambique, What we have in Sofala province, for example. I know Sofala means people who like to talk a lot, but what do we have here that can help us? And talking is very important for peace building. You need to have a dialogue. So let us do that research, let us do that work to interrogate what we have within Africa. I will share some of the insights we have from particularly the southern African part of Africa. In Kenya we have done similar type of exercises. Largely what you see when you look at these ideas, African cultural ideas of society, and the interrogation of the role of the individual and the community is a strong emphasis, in some instances, on social harmony, non-adversarial conflict and dispute resolution, the question of a universal understanding of how peace, justice, reconciliation can be locally grounded, culturally defined. The purpose of justice in many of these societies is to achieve redress, to ensure accountability. Accountability, a big issue we hear now from our debate. And the objective of peace is to restore human dignity, establish fairness, and essentially that means promote the economic well-being in society. From the southern, eastern, central, and southern African regions of Africa, amongst the Bantu people of Africa and the Guni groups within the southern African region, you find this concept, this notion of Ubuntu, which some of you would be familiar with. In Eastern Africa, you could replace it with Muntu or Utu, and it's a variation of the same theme. And Ubuntu ideology or idea or worldview operates on the premise that a human being is a human being through other human beings. That a human being does not exist in isolation. That we are human beings through other human beings. And I think that's a very powerful worldview, very powerful cultural perspective. Because it has implications for politics, it has implications for your economics, and it has implications for your society. And it is a critique of the excessive individualism that we have seen that has been implanted in some of the Eurocentric ideas that we have internalized on our continent. In terms of Ubuntu, and its stages or its approach to peace and reconciliation, there are at least 5 steps that are necessary. The first being the acknowledgement of guilt, and that means you have to speak the truth. You have to uncover the truth of what happened. And this is an interesting question here from Mozambique. Have we really interrogated the truth of what happened in the war? Have we really interrogated the truth of what happened during colonialism? We can go back in time, even further back if you want. But the truth must come out somehow if we are going to, in fact, find a way to go forward and to build a new society. So acknowledgement of guilt, showing of remorse and repenting, very crucial. I think this will be very familiar to our brothers and sisters in the Catholic tradition, GCM. Asking for and giving forgiveness, not easy processes, but very important for the healing of society. And some kind of reparation, restitution. And in this case, it could be the economic paying of a compensation, or it could be a symbolic reparation, like a memorial that acknowledges that these atrocities and these violations happened to these people at this point in time. It's very important for the survivors and the victims to be acknowledged. Otherwise, those wounds and that trauma I was speaking about cannot be healed. We cannot transcend that trauma if we don't articulate the suffering that survivors and victims have endured. And the combination of these stages and these phases is what lays the foundation for what we call reconciliation, which is difficult to define, but it essentially means addressing the deep divisions within society through open processes of dialogue, acknowledging that interdependence, that humanness to other people, and that is the foundation in these traditional Bantu and Guni societies of building peace. If we move to East Africa, and the case of the Acholi of northern Uganda, in northern Uganda, the issue of violent conflict, ethnic tension, colonial exploitation is very similar to many other parts of Africa. We currently have an ongoing crisis in that region, which is still latent, it is not yet resolved. And there are challenges there of even a very bad phenomenon of child abduction and the use of children as soldiers, something that also I know historically Mozambique also experienced. And what happened to those children who are now grown up that fought in the war in this country? Are they really healed in themselves? But the Acholi of northern Uganda have maintained over the centuries their own conflict resolution and reconciliation mechanism called the Mato Oput mechanism. So this is another word you can take away with you. Mato Oput. And the Acholi leadership structures based on models were designed their leadership engagement based on the principles of consensus, building consensus, which is a good thing. Mato Oput based on the principle of consensus, inclusivity, and typically you had a council of elders or community leadership councils. And the interesting thing with the Acholi example is that these councils included both men and women. Of course, we should mention that the problem of patriarchy is equally prevalent in African cultural traditions as it is everywhere else in the world, including Europe. And now we can even be more specific and say even in the White House in Washington, challenges of dealing with the issue of gender. But the Mato Oput process, going back to the cultural framework, had what was called a Kachoke Madit, an assembly of peace and reconciliation. And this council of elders, this assembly played an important role in bringing the community together. The council of elders had an advisory function to the chiefs. They supervised the processes, the different stages of reconciliation, and listening to the views of members of society was very important. Here brings the element of participation and a collective participation. In Kachoke Madit, the victims and the perpetrators engaged in an exchange, and the whole assembly had the opportunity to put questions to the perpetrators and also the victims, and then ultimately make suggestions to the Council of Elders. And so this means that this made this peace process a very lengthy affair. It could take a long time. But it's more important to take time to build a solid peace than to do a very short intervention that in fact collapses and breaks at the seams. So we see this important structure in this cultural framework where witnesses would share willingly. Of course, there are those who would refuse to engage with the process, and that's human, that's natural. But the process cannot move forward unless the perpetrators acknowledge the harm that they have done. That's a very important point. The perpetrators need to acknowledge the harm that they have done. Juxtapose that in Mozambique, and then the question is, have all the perpetrators acknowledged the harm that they did in the past? And we could say that everybody was a perpetrator, or wider societies were perpetrators, right? And I think this is the challenge.